Good afternoon, and welcome to the Society for the Rule of Law's webinar on the presidency. My name is Gregg Nunziata. I am the Executive Director of the Society for the Rule of Law. And before we get started with our very timely conversation today, I just wanted to mention a few administrative things at the top. First, if you're not familiar with us and you've just stumbled on our programming for the first time, welcome. The Society is a national membership organization made up primarily of conservative, libertarian, and right of center lawyers, but we welcome members from all sorts of backgrounds, and our membership does make this programming possible. We as a society prioritize, despite our maybe center-right background, prioritize the defense of the rule of law, the Constitution, and American democracy above any policy or partisan consideration. So we really welcome you to our efforts. We advance our mission in a number of ways through some targeted advocacy and also through thought leadership and symposia and intellectual conversations like we're having today. Again, we're a membership organization. Our membership makes this work possible. So if you are a member, thank you. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining. We have in the chat a link to our website where you can sign up. You don't need to be a lawyer. There are several several levels of membership, and we would really welcome you. As I mentioned, do a lot of programming along these lines. And while we're about to talk about the presidency with the new inauguration of the next administration to come just next week, we are also watching as the Senate fulfills its advice and consent function and is beginning to populate the next cabinet. We had a recent webinar on the advice and consent process, which you may want to go watch. It's on our YouTube page. We'll have a link in the chat for that as well. We also have in-person programming, and our next in-person event is a panel that we will be hosting at the Principal's First Summit here in Washington. That's on the weekend of February 22nd and 23rd. It'll feature George Conway, Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, and Judge J. Michael Ludig, all board members of the Society for the Rule of Law. Now, as we get into this program will be recorded. It will be available on YouTube, so you can come back and watch it later and share with friends. We will have some Q&A towards the end of the conversation, and I invite you to submit your questions just in the chat here. I will keep an eye on them. You do not need to wait for the end of the conversation. If you have a thought, please type away now, and it'll be on my radar, and I'll try to work it into our conversation at the appropriate point. With that, let's get started. I want to introduce and welcome Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who is the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. She's a prolific historian, excellent writer. She is the author of the new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Presidents That Forged the Republic. It's available on Amazon and anywhere else you buy your books. We will have a link to that in the chat as well. I don't have it handy here because I read it on Kindle, but she's also the author of a book called The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. Both really interesting books about the early years of the Republic. And as I often say in our programming, our Constitution, our Republican legacy is about so much more than words on parchment. It's about so much more than laws. It's about these precedents, norms, institutions, and traditions that really go back to the founding generation. And so it's so just welcome, Lindsay. So happy to have you to talk about this and to help kind of fill out the background for our membership as we think about where we're heading into a new administration next week. Dr. Chervinsky, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see all of you here too. I am not a lawyer, and I don't play one on television. So I think that's a good testament that this group is diverse in its, goals, purposes, and membership, and as it should be. Because I often say, my husband's a lawyer, my father's a lawyer, and my brother's a lawyer, so they're like oxygen to me. But the Constitution does not just belong to lawyers, and so we all have to have a better understanding of where we come from. So I thought that I would give just about 10 minutes of remarks sort of to lay out the foundation of what we're talking about in terms of the presidency and the really important precedents that were established early on in the federal government. And then we can take the conversation from there and build out how these things have evolved over time. let me get my slides here because I always find that some pictures are helpful to going through these things. Experience first. Okay, so everyone's seeing the images okay here. Great.
Yep.
So, any conversation about the presidency has to start with the Constitutional Convention. And that is because the Constitution was really quite short, as many of you know, especially Article 2. And Article 2 says relatively little about what it is that the president is actually supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. How the president, so for example, how the president should dress, how the president should interact with citizens, whether or not the president can socialize, whether or not the president can host private events. These are all questions that emerged for the early presidents because they were not addressed in the text. And that was for a couple of reasons. One, the framers of the Constitution did understand that anything they put in writing was going to be limiting. And so they did want to be occasionally vague, both to help secure ratification of the document, but also with the understanding that there would be things coming down the road that they could not possibly foresee. And so that vagueness was actually important because it would allow people to respond organically in the best way possible to actually govern the nation. The other key reason is because of Washington's presence. Now, by the time they got to the meat of the executive, it was in August of 1787. They were meeting in Philadelphia. This picture is not entirely accurate because they actually had the shutters closed to make sure that people couldn't sort of peek in on the proceedings and see what was happening. So, for those of you who have spent time in Philadelphia in August, you can imagine roughly how that room would have felt given that there wasn't air conditioning. And by August, they had been there for 4 months and they were tired and they were grouchy and they were hot and they wanted to go home. And so, as they were thinking about what this part of the Constitution was going to look like, they were often aware that Washington was in the room. And sometimes he sat out at the front of the room on the raised dais, or sometimes he sat with the Virginia delegation where he voted. But everyone understood that if the Constitution was ratified, he was going to be the first president. And so, with that in mind, it was actually fairly awkward to talk about the limitations on that office, to talk about what you would do with that office if someone acted badly with him in the room. And at one point, Benjamin Franklin actually called this out and reminded them that while they could trust Washington to probably make good decisions, they could not be so confident about those that would follow him. And so they really did need to talk about impeachment as a possible method of removal if future presidents were less upstanding. So there was both the awkwardness factor as well as the trust that he would basically figure out the fuzzy bits or the details of the presidency, and they could trust him to establish precedent for those that followed. So, with that in mind, when he took the oath of office in April of 1789 and became the first president, the Constitution gave him relatively little guidance about how to actually fill the office. I love this graph on the left because it shows the length of the Constitution in the United States vis-a-vis other nations. And this is the length with all of our amendments. So without the amendments, the Constitution was only about 4,000 words, which is really not very many words to create a federal government. And so it just is a really helpful visual reminder of the sort of limitations we're talking about. Over the next 8 years, Washington established nearly countless precedents, everything from how an inauguration would look, how a president would host various social events and visiting state dignitaries, leaving after 2 terms, how one would go about giving a annual address to Congress, which we call the State of the Union. But I think his most important precedent was, and perhaps his most underappreciated precedent, was the cabinet. The cabinet was not in the Constitution. In fact, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention explicitly rejected proposals for a cabinet at several different points throughout their conversations because they worried that it would lead to corruption and cronyism at the highest levels of government, that it would obscure transparency, and it would recreate the British system, which they had really just rebelled against a couple years earlier. Washington, knowing that that was their expectation, did not convene a cabinet meeting until 2.5 years into his administration. And I just want to pause and emphasize that because it very much was not there from the beginning. It was not always expected to be there, and it was not a guarantee that it was going to emerge. But instead, Washington felt like when faced with particularly thorny issues, especially issues of diplomatic relations or domestic crises, he really had to have a lot of different perspectives. And the people that he surrounded himself with, when we look at this picture, we see five dead white guys. We don't see a particularly diverse group, but his contemporaries saw a very diverse group that came from different backgrounds with different educations and experience, different religions, different attachments to different types of the economy, so different economic interests. And they understood that they were bringing a lot of different perspectives to the cabinet to give Washington very diverse advice. With the cabinet's assistance, Washington carved out jurisdiction over domestic crises in particular and over foreign policy. So while the executive branch today is obviously much, much larger than it was in 1796, the last full year of Washington's presidency, and while the departments are far more numerous and the breadth of their responsibilities is much larger because we expect the federal government to do a lot more, the idea that the president is the person that is responsible for foreign policy or the president that is supposed to respond when there is a domestic crisis, that goes all the way back to Washington. So, in some way, the character of the president has not changed all that much. Perhaps most importantly, in September of 1796, Washington declared his intention to retire in the farewell address. The farewell address is remembered for many of its very prescient warnings about the future of the United States, which have proven to be relevant generation after generation. But I actually think it's the starting point for one of the most important things he did, which is to start the first transfer of power from one president to the next and to ensure that it occurred while he was actually alive. And that was essential because that meant that it would be planned, that there would be a competitive election, that the American people would go to the polls and would pick their representatives who would pick the next president, that they would learn disappointment from loss if they didn't get the outcome they wanted, that they would witness that transfer, and that a new administration would come in, all while Washington was present and could lend his unparalleled stature to that process to give it legitimacy. That sounds a little bit like hagiography or the sort of type of glorification that we usually try and avoid. But I think it is important to acknowledge that the stature Washington had was so unparalleled, it is hard for us to even comprehend what that looks like today. The person that I can think of that gets closest in terms of sort of universal adoration is Dolly Parton. And she is not in any way a political figure. So if you can apply that sort of like love and admiration to a political figure, that would have been Washington. And that meant both that his presence was incredibly important, but also that his departure was incredibly destabilizing. Americans in 1797 genuinely did not know if the presidency would work with anyone else in it. They genuinely did not know if the other branches of government could work with a different president, or if foreign nations would try and trample all over the executive branch if Washington wasn't in that office. And these were just a couple of the questions that were facing John Adams, who was elected the second president of the United States. I love to share these portraits, not because I think they are particularly good works of art. They are not. The one on the left is perhaps one of the most famous portraits of George Washington, but it's called the Lansdowne portrait. But I actually think it's among the worst. His forehead is kind of weirdly sloped backwards, and his cheeks are quite puffy because he had just had new dentures made. But it is sort of well known for how to depict a president. And today you see a lot of people, especially around President's Day, sort of recreating that pose. If it's not a great portrait, it compared to the John Adams one, it is fantastic. This John Adams portrait is ghastly. And the reason it is ghastly is because they put John Adams' head on George Washington's body. This body is the exact same body that is in all of Washington's military portraits from the Revolutionary War. So the proportions are all wrong. It looks utterly ridiculous. And then if you start to, once you get past the fact that he looks like he's all scrunched with his head, if you look at the background, it's practically the same. It's a very similar carpet, very similar draperies, columns, similar table, similar stuff on the table. And it is a visual demonstration of how hard it was to visualize a presidency without Washington in it. So, with that in mind, I think that John Adams made a couple of really important contributions to the presidency. He knew, and everyone else knew, that whoever came second was going to have a terrible time because everyone was going to fall short after Washington. And the political scene was starting to calcify into two of the early political parties. And so whoever came in second was going to be stuck dealing with that situation. He knew that, and he showed up anyway, which showed remarkable political courage. His inauguration in 1797, the people who were present, they didn't have the benefit of knowing what would come later. And so they viewed this moment as one of the most important historical developments in mankind. It was the first time they had seen a peaceful transfer of power. If you recall, they are living in the era of Napoleon and the era of the French Revolution when revolutions had gone really, really quite badly. And so the fact that they were able to observe a peaceful transfer of power to them was nothing short of remarkable. For most of Adams' presidency, he was grappling with internal divisions within his own party, which existed within his own cabinet and in among the more extreme wing of his party, which I call the Arch Federalists. And they were battling over the character of the executive. They really wanted to seize some of the executive power for themselves, to make their own decisions, which would have turned the executive into a executive by committee, kind of like the British cabinet today. Adams fought to retain the power to make decisions himself, which was a fight to retain the character of the executive as Washington had enjoyed it. And this came to a head in May of 1800 when Adams fired Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, using and this was his letter doing so with no salutation, no thank you for your service. And he changed the locks on the Secretary of State offices for good measure because Pickering was a real jerk, which I'm happy to get into more in our conversation. But this was a very important legal moment because the Constitution did not specify how a secretary was to be removed. And the legislation that created the departments did not specify how a secretary was to be removed. And so this power was all theoretical because Washington had never fired anyone. When Adams did, and the Senate accepted his replacement nomination, who was John Marshall, they established a precedent that was then upheld in 1926 by the Supreme Court. And it, again, was essential to the character of the executive because it meant that secretaries did not have the right to pursue their own agenda separate and apart from the president's if it conflicted with the president's administration. The last really important contribution occurred in the election of 1800 into the transition of 1801 that I want to just close out my remarks on. And that is what it means to create a peaceful transfer of power when it's actually much harder to do so, when you're talking about two different parties and a very contested election and a constitutional crisis. This is Washington, D.C. in 1800 from the perspective of the Capitol looking towards the White House. That fall, when Congress gathered in December, there was a real question about how the election would have an outcome. It had been tied and thrown to the House of Representatives, and the Federalist Party were pursuing any number of schemes to try and sort of steal the presidency. In return, the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Democratic Republicans were threatening violence. And a mob had actually gathered outside the Capitol, which looked like this at the time, threatening to kill anyone who stole the presidency from Thomas Jefferson. So if that sounds familiar, it should, and for good reason. John Adams was at the White House at the time, and he did something that we very rarely celebrate in presidents, which was he exercised restraint. The president did not have a constitutional role in this process, and so he invited Jefferson to the White House. He assured him that he believed that Jefferson was the rightful winner, that he eventually would be chosen as the person that the people had wanted, that John Adams would play no role in the Federalist schemes and would not run for re-election again. And then he stayed out of it. And critically, when Jefferson finally did win, John Adams went home. He lost and he went home in the age of Napoleon, and that was a revolutionary thing to do. When he got home, he wrote a letter to Jefferson and he said, "Everything looks peaceful here. I wish you a safe and happy administration." And that set the tone for what a transition should be, because he had also instructed his cabinet secretaries to cooperate and give briefings to the president long before that was required by statute. So I always like to close with this quote. It was the quote that he wrote to his wife Abigail after his first night in the White House. It is now carved into the marble fireplace on the state floor of the White House. FDR had it added to that fireplace mantle. And I think that it's lovely because it shows his earnestness, his commitment to try and make the presidency stronger than when he inherited it. And I think also a recognition that character in the office matters greatly. Okay, so with that very brief introduction, I am looking forward to talking with Greg.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. I think you still have your screen shared. There we
There
go.
we go.
Um, well, so there's a lot to talk about there, but let's just, I guess, big picture first. In light of history and I guess current practice, what is the American presidency? Like, what's the job if you had to explain it to someone who just woke up from a long sleep?
Yeah. So it's a very complicated job because it's in the modern era it is actually three jobs. It is head of state, which means in moments of crisis that person is in charge. That is the person who represents the nation on the world stage, and it is sort of the one figure that represents all people. It is head of executive, which means that it manages all the executive departments and is the person in charge for seeing the timely and fair execution of the laws that Congress passes. But then more recently, it has also become head of party. And that is definitely a more recent creation that has kind of come in and out as the executive has changed and our party system has evolved. But unsurprisingly, those three responsibilities and those three jobs regularly clash. Because if you have a national crisis, what is in the best interest of the state, the sort of big picture state, is often not in the best interest of your party.
And so the founders had in mind certainly, I guess, head of state and head of the executive, but not so much head of party. They were, I guess, distrustful of the idea of party, and party starts emerging. Uh, I guess really in the late Washington administration, and then fully in the Adams administration. I think I was sort of surprised. Maybe I should have known this, but how little of a party leader Adams seemed to be while this chasm is opening up. So how did the early presidents sort of think about their role to the party versus to the government, I mean, to the country?
Well, I think it depends on who we're talking about and when we're talking about it. So, both Washington and Adams did not see themselves as party men. They certainly were adopted by the Federalist Party and at times were more sympathetic to the Federalist Party than not, but they did not see themselves as party leaders, and they certainly didn't believe that they owed allegiance to the party above anything else. And so that was fine for Washington. That became very complicated for Adams because he ended up splitting with a number of his other party members, and that really undermined his reelection campaign. When Washington he warns against parties in the farewell address, and this warning is often misunderstood. What he's saying is not that we can't organize politically. What he's saying is you don't want to allow your partisan allegiance to a certain party to overpower your allegiance to the United States or to your fellow Americans. So you don't want your allegiance to a particular party to be more important than the feeling you might have towards your neighbor. And that's actually a very different warning. Other of the founders sort of had different feelings about parties. Madison understood that partisan spirit was always going to be a part of politics, but he thought that there would be a lot of parties, that there would be many, and they would sort of form governing coalitions at different moments to achieve different aims, but then those coalitions would dissolve and reform to achieve a different goal, which is why they didn't necessarily anticipate a fairly firm two-party system in the Constitution. People like Jefferson and Hamilton eventually came to be very enthusiastic about parties and were very willing to embrace them for their own political purposes.
A little bit more about, I guess, the early parties, because we in this society talk a lot about the need for citizens to put the Constitution and American democracy first and partisan concerns second. And I think sometimes it feels like we live in this crazy partisan time where we don't just have parties, but we have this kind of Manichaean understanding of politics and think that people on the right think the other party is trying to destroy the country and vice versa. And kind of reading your work, it's sort of maybe comforting to see that there was that kind of view at the beginning too, amongst the two parties that were emerging, that the other side really was seen as the enemy of America. So can you just tell that story a little bit, and how do we get through it?
Absolutely. So the first two parties were the Federalists, and then the other party, they call themselves the Republicans, but they should not be confused with the Republican Party of Lincoln or the Republican Party of Reagan or the Republican Party of today. It was, we often in history books call it the Jeffersonian Republicans to distinguish. And what made their animosity toward one another so intense was a couple of factors. One, the nation was still quite young and quite fragile, and almost everyone who was in the political sphere at this time had been somehow involved in the revolution. And so they literally had skin in the game, and they understood the stakes of how close they had come to not succeeding. They had already lived through one failed system. The Articles of Confederation had failed. And so they were terrified that any one misstep would doom the entire project. So they really understood the stakes. And they also had fundamentally different visions of what the nation should be. And so those different worldviews, as well as this feeling that like one wrong step will have the whole thing come tumbling down, led to this real intensity of partisan spirit. But the second half that I think is quite important and relevant for today is that the parties were also very weak. And because the parties were very weak, they could not protect more moderate voices. They could not encourage compromise. They could not encourage people to work across the aisle. And they could not protect people from the more radical voices in their own party. And that meant that when Adams decided to pursue compromise and diplomacy with France in particular, he was lambasted and destroyed by the extremists in his own party because they wanted war for their own political purposes. And they felt like it would be more beneficial to the other party in the upcoming election. And I think that explains a lot where we currently are in this moment. Our parties have been on the decline for the last couple of decades. They're not able to protect against primaries by more extreme members. They're not able to encourage as much bipartisan cooperation and legislation. And so you do see the more extreme voices driving people to the polls. What got us through the moment in 1800 and 1801 is what I define as civic virtue, which is a willingness by at least a handful of people to put the Constitution above those partisan impulses, which on one hand is quite comforting because it means we don't need military bravery, like, huge feats of military genius or the type of intellect like an Albert Einstein to get us through that moment. And so civic virtue in theory should not be a particularly high bar, but sometimes it feels like it can't be.
Yeah, as a historian, I mean, do you have a sense that America just got really lucky? I mean, we talk a lot, the American model of a strong presidency seems to have been attempted in a lot of countries, and it's not gone well. There are a lot of Latin American countries that had American style constitutions and
Mhm.
devolved into military rule rather quickly, or some sort of authoritarianism. Uh,
Mhm.
did we do something right consciously, or do we get really lucky at the time, or with these particular men at the helm setting the precedents that you cover?
Yeah, I think there are a couple factors. One, I think that they set up a system such that at least we benefited in the beginning that Congress in particular was quite jealous of its own authority and quite protective of its own power. And it exercised very strict and energetic oversight over the executive. And critically, the executive was supportive of that. Even though Washington and Adams used and wielded executive power with pretty great force, they still were very respectful of congressional oversight, believing that was an important part of the job. That I think is one of the failures of our current moment is that Congress has abdicated its responsibility both to exercise oversight over the executive and also the Supreme Court in a way that is very unusual if we look at like the scope of mankind for an institution to so willingly neuter itself in so many different political conversations. So I think that is one piece. The other piece that is important if we look at this, especially comparatively to other nations and other revolutions, the American Revolution was actually quite conservative. the same people who were in power for the most part before the revolution were in power after the revolution. We did not guillotine an entire class of people. We still had mostly the same social structure and critically, mostly the same legal structure. We borrowed extensively from British common law and basically reapplied it to our system with some tweaks here and there. And that meant both that we were not undergoing a radical change, but also that our civic culture of participation in those institutions and that type of law was embedded for centuries. And we know, based on other nations and our studies of other nations, that it takes a long time to teach Americans how to do these things. That it's really easy if you don't have a tradition of it or if you don't have precedent of it to just throw it away. And because a lot of the framers and the founding generation did not take this for granted, they were not willing to throw it away. And I think for me, the difference I see between then and now in our current moment is a lot of Americans take it for granted because they think that, oh, well, we've been here for 250 years. We'll continue to be here for 250 years, even if we take a flamethrower to institutions. And that's really not how it works.
I couldn't agree more with that. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more about the cabinet and well, I guess this is an intersection of a few things. The cabinet and Congress, the executive, we're having the confirmation proceedings this week, the hearings for Trump's cabinet picks. I meant to mention this earlier. I don't think I did. We can drop a link in the chat. The Society for the Rule of Law sent up a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee spelling out what we thought the role of an attorney general was and what kind of test we think the Senate should apply in a confirmation process. How do you think the Senate should think about confirmation? I mean, you clearly explained how the cabinet and department heads work for the president. That was established early on, but they're not just his tools, right? They have some
Hmm.
other obligations, and that's why the Senate is involved in the process. So,
Hmm.
so what makes a good cabinet member? What should the Senate be asking?
Yeah, it's a great question. Washington had a couple of different considerations for what he was looking for in a cabinet secretary, and that has largely been the precedent that most other presidents have followed. So, first of all, the person had to have some experience and knowledge about the field and the position they were going into, which sounds like a duh thing to say, but it's actually turns out an important distinction because he understood that each of these positions have two roles. One is to manage the department, and the other is to provide advice. And if you don't know what you're talking about, it's really hard to do both of those things. He also wanted the people to have advice and experience that was different than his own because he wanted to be able to ensure he was getting a lot of different perspectives, or to put it another way, was not surrounded by yes men. That was quite essential. And he wanted their perspectives to be different from each other. So he wanted them to be a diverse bunch. And our definition of what diversity is has expanded over time in lockstep with who counts as a citizen. So, for example, Lincoln was the first president to have a secretary west of the Mississippi. Theodore Roosevelt was the first secretary to have a Jewish cabinet secretary. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first secretary to have a female cabinet secretary. Um, let's see. Lyndon Johnson was the first president to have an African American secretary. I mean, moving forward. So that is an important part of the distinction. Now, that has gotten a little bit more complicated in recent years because the bureaucracies are so big that the management piece is not always possible to get in the same human form as a good advisor. It's not always possible to find somebody who is good at managing that department and somebody that you want to get that advice from. And so a president has to definitely balance those things. In the past, as long as the person has been reasonably qualified and doesn't have major conflicts of interest, the Senate has largely deferred to the president. Typically, differences of political opinion have not been something that has stood in the way of Senate confirmation. But I should say that those first two pieces, that they are reasonably qualified and they do not have conflicts of interest, are really important and have caused the Senate to both reject candidates in the past, or the candidates have sort of removed themselves from consideration. And so, as we're looking forward to this administration, I would say that there are a number of candidates who fall into that category of reasonably qualified, no clear conflict of interest. I don't personally agree with some of their politics, but by and large, it makes sense to me that the Senate would confirm them because the president does have a right to appoint their people as long as they are quote unquote safe department secretaries. There are also people who I think do not fit those categories, and that is a different conversation.
I've got one more question I want to ask you before we turn to some of our audience questions. We have quite a few coming in, and those of you out there who have thoughts, please share them in the chat, and I will try to get to as many as I can. Uh, I want to just talk a little bit about the military and the military's role in America and in our politics, in domestic law enforcement. A lot of controversy or debate or concern about how the military might be used in the coming years. The I think a lot about how Washington, came to prominence as a general, and the president is commander in chief. But we've not had a militarized presidency in the sense that some other countries have had. So how did that develop, and how do we kind of get a separate understanding of the president as commander in chief versus as a military man, and how did that civilian control over the military, how did that develop over the first couple of presidencies? There's some tests of these principles in both administrations. So.
Yes. This is such an important question because it was something that they were so aware of, and they didn't always succeed perfectly, which I actually think is really important because it is a hard question. Civilian control of the military and civil military relations was really hard in 1789, it was really hard in 1798, and it's still really hard today. So, when Washington was commander in chief of the Continental Army, he was meticulous about deferring to congressional power because he understood that they were trying to create a republic in which it was not led by a military. And so, at times, he humbled himself in ways that we would often consider to be quite embarrassing because he was trying to ensure that Congress had and retained authority over him. And that sometimes required humbling because he had this incredible stature. Now, when he returned his commission to Congress at the very end of the war, that was an important step in ensuring that this process would be institutionalized going forward because it meant that he would not be a military dictator. During the war, he also took a number of steps to sort of defeat threats by the military to civilian government, including the most famous one, which was called the Newburgh Conspiracy. And as a side note, we have recently acquired at the George Washington Presidential Library an amazing letter that Washington wrote right after the Newburgh Conspiracy that is 11 pages long in his hand, talking about this threat. It's amazing. I hope if you are all in the DC area, we are having an open house on President's Day at the library. It is free and open to the public. We will have lots of amazing treasures out. So I hope you will come see us. But I digress. So that was something that he was very aware of. Then, when he became president, he drew very important distinctions between what it meant to be a military leader and what it meant to be a war leader. So early on in his presidency, he did a tour through the northern states. And on his way up, they asked him to review troops. And he said, no. He said, I am not a military leader. We are not at war. The best I can do is parade by, but I will not review military action because that would be inappropriate. I also think that another moment that is quite important is the Whiskey Rebellion, which many of you might know about in 1794, when Washington marched out with a number of state militias to crush a rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. Now, critically, he turned around before they had any conflict and he went back to Philadelphia. And evidence suggests to me that he was not wearing a military uniform while doing so because he did not want to be seen as arresting his fellow citizens as president, which I think is a really important distinction. John Adams had a little bit more trouble with this because when there was a threat of war with France, Congress had built up the army and he asked Washington to come back to manage that army. And that led to basically a standoff between the two of them over who actually got to control officer nominations and who was in charge. And this is when I mentioned they didn't do it perfectly. Here, Washington, I think, really undermined the presidency in a way that he would have never permitted while he was in office. And he got really lucky that it did not go badly. But towards the end of Adams' presidency, he sort of reasserted himself over this process. So all of which is to say it was very complicated back then. And today we, have some additional measures of protection, but things like the Insurrection Act, which allows the president to use armed forces domestically, was largely created during Washington's presidency and has not really been amended all that much since and is in desperate need of some revision, in my humble opinion.
Well, I love the story of the Newburgh conspiracy. I mean, it's maybe the most dramatic for me anyway, as I remember as a student reading about it the first time. It's just this really evocative moment of Washington's just by force of character and reputation, kind of shaming
Hmm.
possibly seditious troops into Republican obedience, and it's
Hmm.
a dramatic moment. I'm excited to hear about that letter. So let me turn to some of the questions we have here. One of the questions we have from an audience member is how much of what we understand to be the presidency results of basically a couple of centuries of gentlemanly behavior. Do we have real protections against kind of the next president is mentioned specifically, but say someone who was did not have that sense of stewardship and really wanted to drive for increased executive power. I mean, is our democracy really safe from that? What protections do we have?
Thank you for this question. My guess is if I had answered it 15 years ago, my answer would look quite different than it is today because you're correct that most of the system is built on norm and custom and precedent and expectation by the American people of a certain level of decor and decorum. And the expectation that if someone veered from that, the public shame that would be sort of poured upon their head and their reputation would be sufficient for either a course correction or to force them out of office. So things like, for example, um, generally presidents don't shill a particular brand of canned vegetables or beans from the White House because it's seen to be inappropriate to favor one American brand over another, and it is beneath the dignity of the office. That is a Norman custom. There's nothing in the law books that says that a president can't talk about one particular type of canned bean, but we expect that presidents will behave differently. Now, that is obviously a relatively harmless transgression, but I think it's a particularly colorful example of what we're talking about. I would have said that there are a number of rules that do keep presidents in certain boundaries, things like the Hatch Act, which no president has perfectly followed, but most sort of did a good faith effort to follow. I'm sorry, by the way, if you're hearing my hound in the background. I believe it's the mailman time, and so I apologize if you're hearing barking. The Hatch Act, there are a number of other expectations about whether or not, like, for example, Jimmy Carter put his peanut farm in a blind trust so as to not appear to have a conflict of interest. Things about, sort of like foreign gifts and that variety. But it turns out that those are relatively toothless and that enforcement of them is very difficult and that it's pretty easy to sweep them all aside. And so I think that you're right. Most of the presidency has been based on presidents doing their best, not perfect, never perfect. Most acted in good faith. Most of the time it was an honor system, but we have, I think, realized how fragile that system is in the last 10 years.
The transfer of power, certainly, I think many of us have taken for granted. I think
Mhm.
we no longer can. But as we're about to have another inauguration, I'm curious how much of the pomp and ceremony around the transfer of power and the inauguration goes back to the beginning. One thing that I was actually kind of surprised to learn in your book was that John Adams did not attend the inauguration of
Mhm.
Jefferson, but Washington impressed people by attending the inauguration of Adams. So
Yeah. So Adams did not attend his, but I think that he often gets a bad rap for that, and here's why. The tradition that a president who loses attends an inauguration was actually not started until 1845. And Washington's presence was so useful at Adams because it lent it legitimacy and it helped instill this sense of prestige in the office. Adams, I believe, was quite worried. Well, first of all, he Jefferson didn't invite him, and I think he was quite worried after how horrible the election and transition had been and how close it had come to all being thrown away, that his presence would be a distraction and it would actually make it harder to turn the page and to have that transition and to give Jefferson a fresh slate. So, and what's interesting is that Jefferson didn't complain about it at the time. Later, he took the opportunity to sort of criticize Adams for it. But at the moment, he seemed totally fine with Adams not being there. The pomp and circumstance, it of course has expanded in scope because most things have expanded in scope. But when Washington went to his first inauguration, granted it wasn't a transfer, but an inauguration, New York City, the harbor was filled with thousands and thousands and thousands of ships that people had decorated to welcome him in as he crossed the bay. The city was lined with every single street was filled. There was tons of cannon fire. There was music. When Adams had his inauguration, there was a certain level of pomp and circumstance as well. And I think that it is quite intentional and it is quite useful. And I would even argue it's valuable because it instills these practices and these institutions with meaning. It helps uphold them and bolster them against threats, both internal and external. And most of these things are not enforced by military might. Like we don't enforce our transition by military might, or at least have not had to yet. And we don't want to. But if you have this type of ceremony, it helps ensure that people understand how important they are and how significant they are to the character of our government.
We had a question asking you to expand on this idea of a stronger party and how that might, a stronger party system and how that might help improve the functioning of our democracy, which I suppose is maybe contrary to what the founders thought. So, could you just talk about that a little more?
Yes, so I think if we're going to have a two-party system, which we do have right now, and would require a great deal of reform at the primary level and even potentially in Congress to have a multi-party system. We would want to have strong parties because strong parties in the past, for example, when a party has been strong, they have weeded out dangerous and extreme voices, not just people they disagree with, but like, for example, the Republican Party repudiated David Duke, who was the former, I don't know what his title was, but he was very high up in the Ku Klux Klan. Most of us can agree that's a good thing. Like, we don't want that to be a central figure in the Republican Party because it is not good for our political life. They also can protect against primaries of incumbents from more radical forces. So we have seen a rapid rise in primaries, especially in the Republican Party in the last 15 years, that has led to more extreme voices coming into the House because the primary voter base is not necessarily representative of how most Americans feel. It tends to be the most extreme, most active wing of a party. And so it will drive the party in a direction that is not actually reflective of how most people feel. And it leads to worse representation for most Americans, which is why you see in a lot of polls today, Americans say neither of the parties represent where I am because you've seen that polarization. Strong parties also encourage bipartisan legislation. So it used to be that when we had stronger parties, the leaders in both the House and the Senate were regular champions of bipartisan legislation. Bob Dole was a great example of this. He was the Republican Party candidate at one point. He was, a lion in Congress, but he was also the key sponsor for a number of bipartisan bills, including the American Disabilities Act and a lot of other things that we wouldn't necessarily associate with the extremist wing of the Republican Party today. And so I think that those examples are things that a strong party would do that would improve the tenor of our political conversation.
Another question, bring us back to the civilian control of the military and just sort of your understanding of how this works and kind of what's rooted in the founding. Particularly, this question is, can military leadership refuse illegal or immoral orders of the president? Can the president fire and replace military leadership at his own discretion without any congressional insight? Like how,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah. So I should I
our
should
relationship?
be I should be very clear that I am not a military law expert.
Yeah.
And so
I think you talk about how the founders thought about that. How
yes, yeah.
important was
So
it? Yeah.
please
Yeah.
take that with a grain of salt. My understanding is that in the armed forces, soldiers and officers are actually not obligated to follow an illegal order. And in fact, they are obligated not to follow an illegal order. And that there are sort of avenues for addressing those things. And this is made most famous by the movie A Few Good Men and the Code Red Order. So if anyone wants that context, that's, sort of
Yeah.
a
And the
starting point.
military, they take oaths of office too, right?
Yes, they do. And critically, they take an oath to the Constitution,
Yeah.
not to the president, which is very important.
Yeah.
The founders they very much had a different experience with the military because they did not have a professionalized military. They had militias, and then they had armed forces that they built up and then brought down depending on the threat at any given moment. And so when I was talking about the sort of squabbling over control of the army, that was because the army at the time was quite politicized and was basically being used as a spoil system for the Federalist Party. So it is an army that we would be extremely uncomfortable with today. And Hamilton had quite nefarious ideas about what to do with it, including crushing his domestic opponents and marching it south to Latin America to stir up some revolutions. So that is definitely not the army that we are looking for in this current moment. But they did have disagreements over who should be in charge of military leadership. During the war, Congress was in charge of who was an officer, what sort of rank they were when they received a promotion. It wasn't necessarily merit based. It was, but it also had to be balanced among the states, which is a terrible way to design an officer corps, given that you don't want to have the same number of generals from Virginia and, say, Delaware. So there was a recognition that that maybe wasn't a great idea and that there should be a chain of command. But the question is who has the final say? And ultimately, the president does have the final say, but today that is, again, much more professionalized, and we sort of have standard steps of promotion and a hierarchy among the officer corps.
This may be a softball question for any historian, but why study history? And why is it important, particularly in a republic, you think, for people to have understanding of these stories that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so broadly speaking, it's important to study history because we cannot possibly understand our moment that we're currently living in if we don't know where we've come from, because this moment was produced by things that happened before. And we are actually a very young nation. 250 years is really quite young by global standards. And many of the decisions that were made in the 1770s to 1790s still directly impact what we are seeing today, what politicians and public officials can do today. And so understanding that through line is critical. In terms of our republic in particular, we are the only nation that was founded on an idea. Most other nations were founded based first on either physical borders or a shared religion or a shared ethnic background or a hereditary base. That's not what we are. And that is an incredible opportunity, but it's also sometimes harder because you have to justify why you're going to continue to have this thing if you don't have a shared set of DNA or religious beliefs or, shared borders. And so understanding the history, I think, sometimes helps us understand why the idea, even if imperfectly implemented, is still worth fighting for.
So tell us now, before we wrap up, a little bit about, if you don't mind, about the library. So you're the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon, and I think maybe a lot of Americans, particularly people in the DC area, are pretty familiar with the estate of Mount Vernon, the museum over there. But the library is, I think, a little less well known. So tell us what you're doing there. You mentioned there's going to be this open house. Share, please.
Absolutely. Well, you would not be alone if you didn't know about the library. It's actually only 11 years old, so it is relatively new, and certainly, lots of people visited Mount Vernon before it was there. George Washington originally wrote about having a library in his presidency, but he was never able to make it happen, and because the first president that had a presidential library was FDR, and then after he had one, Hoover backfilled, and some of the others have backfilled, but. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association is the private organization that was founded in the 1850s to buy Mount Vernon and then preserve it And they felt in the 21st century that we really needed to have a space that could house Washington items and help us understand that time period, but also its impact on American history more broadly. And so we have a beautiful library and would love to welcome you. We have all sorts of public programs that are free to the public regularly. Highly encourage you take a look at the website. We have daytime programs. We have research fellowships that are not just for historians, they are for lots of different types of scholars.
Even
We are always,
lawyers?
even lawyers, we are looking really to expand. One of my goals is to expand our research program and our study on the Constitution and the presidency and George Washington, if it's applicable, across an interdisciplinary field. So we want to have lots of different perspectives on what that looks like. We have great digital offerings, which you can see. We have podcasts, we have leadership institutes. But if you don't have plans on President's Day, especially if the weather's bad and you want to come be inside, the library is going to be open. It is an open house. We will have programming. We will have really cool documents that you can see. We will have all sorts of great features. So would love to see you there.
Thank you so much. We're close to the end of the hour. Is there anything that I haven't asked you or thoughts you'd like to share before we close?
Hmm. We kind of went all over the
We
place.
covered we covered we covered a lot. You're not obliged to
No, I mean, I think the last thing that I would say is, like studying the institution on one hand reminds you that these people are deeply fallible and they're just humans that are doing their best sometimes. And sometimes, as we were talking about, there's some real duds in that lineup. So President's Day is kind of a thing we can agree on, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I believe in the institution and I believe it's worth preserving and doesn't mean it doesn't need reform. Lord knows it does. But I think it's worth trying to preserve and trying to make better in the future.
Well, I would like to thank you so much, Lindsay, for joining us. I think this is a really fun conversation. I'm sure the audience joined it and learned a lot, enjoyed it, learned a lot like I did. Um, I think as we said at the top, I think you and I both agree that the kind of work we're trying to do in the Society for the Rule of Law is about so much more than laws and lawyers. And it's about engaging citizens in all these values that we share and maintaining the American experiment. Thank you for helping us do that today. And just a reminder to everyone who's watching, we're a membership organization. Please consider going to our website and joining if you haven't already, or tell your friends to do so. This conversation will be uploaded to YouTube probably later today. Look for it. Feel free to share the link with friends and colleagues. Follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn for announcements about our upcoming programming. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Dr. Chervinsky. Appreciate it.
Thank you.